There are lands where silence settles like a mist, where time no longer ticks but breathes in slow, ancient rhythms. Along the banks of a river older than most spoken words, the air is thick with stories that refuse to be forgotten. Stones sleep under the sand, their corners worn smooth by 1,000 nights of wind and memory. In the hush between day and dusk, when the golden light loses its edge and turns to a velvet softness, the veil thins just enough to hear the whispers. These are not the loud tales carved in marble, nor the ones preserved in polished archives, but the quiet ones, those etched in the grain of temple walls, in the hush of burial chambers, in the shimmer of stars over the desert. They do not come when summoned, nor explain themselves when asked. They linger like breath on a mirror, fading before they are ever fully seen. It begins with water, always water, a current slow and steady, coiling its way through sand and stone, as if remembering its role in something far older than land. Along this water's edge, the first dreams of gods began to take shape. Not in thunder or fire, but in the slow emergence of order from formlessness. A world not made, but revealed, as if it had always been waiting just beneath the surface. The ancient ones believed that from the silence of the deep, from the unformed darkness, life rose not as an accident, but as a necessary rhythm in a song too old for voices. They did not speak of beginning as a moment, but as a cycle, one that spiraled and coiled and folded in upon itself. A sun rose, not once, but forever. It died, not in despair, but in ritual, in return. Here, in this land of dunes and flooded plains, myth was never myth. It was breath, law, tide, flame, and fate. To walk beneath the gaze of the falcon-headed god was not to worship blindly, but to participate in the delicate weave of existence itself. Every grain of wheat, every rising flood, every bolt of linen laid upon the dead. These were not merely actions, but affirmations that the world was still in balance, that chaos had not yet broken through the cracks. The people did not pray to be spared. They prayed to remember the names, the stories, the sacred paths worn into the soul of the land. One might imagine such beliefs faded when the last temples fell silent, or when the language of the glyphs was lost. But belief is not bound by the voice that speaks it. It is carried in the curve of the scarab's shell, in the alignment of stone upon stone, in the stories passed down in shapes and shadows. It is carried, even now, by those who listen with the heart tilted just so, toward wonder, toward longing, toward something remembered but unnamed. It is said the gods once walked here, their steps echoing through the colonnades of golden halls. But if they did, they have not left. They have simply grown quieter, like the stars that still shine though no longer chart our seas. The myths they left behind do not ask for belief. They ask for stillness, for breath, for the patience to follow a thread that winds through darkness and does not promise arrival, only presence. So lie still. Let the weight of modern hours fall away. Let the sand cover your feet and the scent of incense curl around your thoughts like smoke. Somewhere behind your closed eyes, a temple opens, not in brick and mortar, but in memory. The gods are already there, waiting, unhurried. Time slips sideways in these places. The sun will rise again, just as it always has, just as it always will. But first, we remember. Tonight, let's wander where no maps can guide us. Welcome to Forgotten History. before the gods had names and the sky had shape, there was only a stillness so vast it swallowed even thought itself, a silent ocean of unlit potential, unformed and unmeasured, drifting without direction beneath a sky that had not yet been drawn. In this deep and endless darkness, the ancient ones imagined a breath, the first ripple, not of time, but of intention. They called it Nun, the boundless water, not like river or rain, but an infinite presence that held no memory of beginning, no image of ending, just motionless waiting. From this ocean came not light, but something stranger, a self-aware silence that longed to reflect, and so it became a god, not born but risen, alone and vast, containing within its formlessness the shape of every future form. It named itself Atum, a being complete within itself, neither male nor female, light nor shadow, but the unity of opposites waiting to divide. With no other to witness the act, Atum created companions from his own essence. Through spit and sigh, through thought and gesture, Shu and Tefnut emerged, embodiments of air and moisture, the first separations within the infinite oneness. Their union brought forth Geb and Nut, earth and sky, held so tightly together that nothing could yet exist between them. And so Shu lifted Nut high above, arching her into the heavens, her body becoming the vault of stars, her laughter the sound of wind over dunes. Beneath her, Geb sighed, pressing his spine against the raw skin of the earth, and in the stretch between their longing came the world. Here, within this sacred distance, the breath of gods became soil, the silence of gods became night, and the gaze of gods became the shimmering line where water met horizon. From the stillness emerged rhythm, the rhythm of the sun and flood, of death and germination. A cycle not invented but uncovered, as though it had always been etched into the bones of the land. These stories were not told as metaphors, nor doubted as myths. They were lived as memory, woven into the flood's return and the harvest's promise, spoken not to explain but to remember. And when rain kissed stone and the Nile whispered at midnight, one might still hear that ancient sigh, the one that first parted sky from earth and named light with no witness but shadow. But if the first god never had a face, who was it that looked back through the still water that day? They said the gods did not arrive all at once, but unfolded like petals from a flower too ancient to name. Each deity born not in chaos, but in layered echoes of the first gesture, reflections of need, of fear, of hunger and hope. In the golden light of the first dynasties, the gods were not distant. They were the bones of the world itself, wearing forms drawn from beasts and stars, wrapped in symbols whose meanings shifted like the Nile's tide. There was Ra, the sun in motion, not just across the sky, but through realms of silence, riding his solar bark from dawn to dusk, and beyond, into the depths of the Duat, where serpents coiled and the stars themselves dared not shine. Each day he was born anew as Khepri, scarab of morning, and each night he aged into autumn, swallowed by the western horizon, only to return again, radiant and whole, his cycle a mirror of breath, of blood, of belief. Yet he was not alone, for beside him moved Thoth with the head of the ibis, scribe of balance, memory of the gods, who held not a pen but a rhythm that could inscribe the world into being. There too was Hathor, mother of joy and storm, whose milk fed the dead and whose fury could unravel cities. And Anubis, jackal-headed sentinel of shadow, guardian of the threshold between breath and silence, whose blackened skin mirrored the fertile soil where the body was laid, not to rot, but to wait. The gods did not dwell in heaven nor walk among mortals. They were everywhere and nowhere, present in gesture and ritual, in flame and ash, in every utterance that dared name them. Temples rose not as monuments but as homes for their essence, each wall etched with scenes not of stories but of functions, divine mechanics in eternal repetition. To walk there was not to witness art, but to enter rhythm, to stand inside memory made stone. Priests did not serve but sustained, performing the sacred actions not as choice but as necessity. For if the gods were not fed, not bathed, not sung to with the right words, then creation itself might forget how to remain awake. Yet, even as gods multiplied and merged, as cults rose and fell like tides, one principle endured, older than any name or symbol: the weightless feather of Ma'at, the balance at the center of all things. And if that feather were ever to drift from the scale, who would feel its absence first, the gods or the stars, in the realm where the wind carried not only sand but sorrow, and where the edges of night curled around temple walls like forgotten prayers, there once rose a tale that bled into every ritual, every funeral hymn, every painted coffin slid into the cool shadows of the tomb. It was not a tale merely told but relived, mourned, and remembered as if it had happened only yesterday, for it carried the weight of death and something even heavier: continuation. Osiris, green of flesh and crowned in serenity, stood not as a conqueror but as a giver, a bearer of cycles, the one who taught wheat to listen to rain, who taught humans that to govern was not to rule but to restore. He walked gently upon the Nile's banks, his feet kissing soil like a blessing, his words settling over villages like morning mist. The people did not fear him, they revered him, for he brought order not with thunder, but with hands that planted, with eyes that watched, with silence that listened. Beside him moved Isis, not merely queen nor consort, but the breath between his thoughts, the magic between his steps, the rhythm to which the world quietly learned to sway. Her presence was not loud but unfailing, as steady as the moon's path across a sky drenched in longing. Their rule was golden, not in wealth but in memory, for it set a tone, a vibration, a sacred chord struck in the deepest corners of the land. Yet where light stands still too long, shadow grows restless. And so Set, red of gaze, bitter of soul, rose not in hunger but in rupture, a force not of rebellion but of dissonance. He watched, waited, and one day wove a box of cedar and enchantment, shaped not with hatred but with precision. At a feast adorned in music and wine, he brought the box, declaring it a gift for any man it fit perfectly. Laughter echoed, eyes sparkled, but when Osiris laid himself inside, out of curiosity, grace, perhaps trust, the lid closed with a silence that seemed to end the world. Molten lead sealed it shut, and Set's grin was not of victory, but of detachment, as the box was cast into the Nile, swallowed by water too gentle to protest. Osiris drifted, not to an afterlife, but to dismemberment, to dispersal, to becoming the spaces between things. When Isis learned of it, her mourning did not echo. It fell inward, folding upon itself, becoming movement. She cut her hair, cast off her titles, and wandered, not like a queen, but like the last breath of a forgotten song. Through swamps and cities she searched, her voice sometimes a bird's cry, sometimes the hush of reeds bending in sympathy. The chest had drifted to Byblos, lodged in a tree that grew so swiftly it swallowed it whole, until its trunk was hewn into a palace pillar by hands who never knew they carved around a god. Isis, disguised, infiltrated the court, her silence sharper than blades, her sadness deeper than wells. When the truth emerged, the chest was returned, but Set was watching still. Enraged, he tore Osiris's body into 14 pieces and cast them across the map of Egypt like a cruel offering to oblivion. Again, Isis wept, but not out of weakness. Each tear became direction, each sob a compass. Joined by Nephthys, she drifted in a papyrus boat, gathering her beloved in pieces, each fragment buried or enshrined, making of the land a reliquary, a map of grief and reunion. Only one part remained lost, devoured by the Nile's creatures, and even that she replaced, with gold, with symbolism, with memory so potent it bore fruit. Through rite and chant, through gesture and name, she reassembled him, not to live, but to spark one last flame. From that final fire, Horus was conceived, not of joy, not of desire, but of destiny. And as Osiris slipped quietly into the underworld, no longer king of earth, but judge of what lies beneath, the world above waited, breath held, for a child born not in peace but in a silence so deep it trembled the stars. And if her tears shaped the river, how many more would it take to bring him home, in the places where reeds whisper secrets to the wind and the mist rises like a sigh from the still waters of the delta? A child was hidden, cradled not by royalty or armies, but by silence and spell. Horus, born not into peace but into aftermath, opened his eyes not to lullabies but to loss. For his father was no longer of this earth, and his mother walked with the weight of memory heavy upon her breath. She carried him away from the eyes of men and gods alike, wrapping him in anonymity as one wraps a flame in cloth, knowing that even a whisper of his presence might summon forces eager to extinguish him. The marshes became their fortress, the swaying grasses their veil, the hush of birds their only heralds, and through days thick with heat and nights threaded with danger, Isis stood sentinel, her magic woven into every ripple of water, every shadow cast by moonlight upon the still pools where crocodiles drifted like forgotten thoughts. Set searched, relentless, his anger not the fire of a moment but the cold, calculated fury of a force unwilling to yield. And the land itself seemed to watch, holding its breath, for within this child stirred not just blood but prophecy. Horus did not grow like other children, for time in the marshes bends, stretches, coils upon itself, and his lessons came not from scrolls or priests, but from trial and vision, from pain and recovery, from the quiet knowledge that he was both boy and beacon. When scorpions stung and sickness struck, Isis summoned spells older than language, calling upon the healing force of remembrance, binding his soul to hers not with fear, but with will. In some nights, Thoth himself was said to visit, his voice low as mist, offering not instruction but memory, for wisdom in such times could not be taught. It had to be reawakened, and when Horus was no longer a child but not yet a man, when the weight of purpose grew too large to ignore, he rose from the marsh not as a prince seeking a crown, but as a son seeking a voice, a reckoning, a restoration. Yet justice among the gods was no swift decree, no simple blade of verdict, and so he was summoned to the celestial court, where eternity itself bent low to listen. Before the tribunal of divine elders, Horus stood not in rage but in truth, his claim not forged in ambition but in lineage, in loss, in the rhythm of what had once been and must be again. Set contested him, not as a villain, but as a force, of strength, of storm, of disruption made flesh. Their struggle unfolded not in one place, not in one moment, but across years and forms through riddles and combat, through transformation and cunning. Gods watched and waited, debated and shifted, some aligning with order, others with the necessity of chaos, for the cosmos had room for both but demanded balance. In one tale, Horus lost his eye, a wound not of flesh alone but of vision, of clarity, and it was only through restoration that he came to understand the deeper shape of healing, not to return what was, but to remake what could be. The eye, once shattered, became whole, and in its new form, it no longer served only Horus. It became the symbol of protection, of offering, of completeness made from fracture. When he gave it to Osiris, placed it upon the lips of his silent father beneath the earth, it was not just a gift, but a bridge, a gesture that closed the circuit of blood and memory and meaning. The gods saw, and in that moment, the judgment leaned toward Horus, not with thunder, but with silence, the kind that follows understanding. The throne was returned, the land began to breathe again, and Set, though not destroyed, was cast into the spaces beyond. Some say to guard foreign lands, others say to wander, always just beyond the horizon of peace. And if the eye once broken became whole again, then what of the wound it left behind? In the shadowed corners of shrines where incense coils in slow spirals and the air hums with the faint memory of hymns, the gods do not sleep. They shift, change, remember. They are not frozen in legend, but fluid, responsive, as if each era carves them anew yet leaves their essence untouched. Egyptian deities were never a fixed pantheon etched in uniform stone, but a constellation of beings who merged and divided, rose and faded, whose names echoed differently across temples and towns, across time and tide. They came with falcon heads, lion bodies, crocodile jaws, ibis beaks, and the faces of forgotten ancestors, not as mere symbols, but as lenses, as masks through which truth took on shape, reminding those who gazed upon them that divinity was not a matter of form, but of force, and that one name could hold many faces without contradiction. Among them stood Ra, the golden pulse of the heavens, whose solar journey was not just a story of day and night, but a ritual, a rhythm, a reassurance that darkness was not the end, but the interval between brightness. Each morning he rose as Khepri, the scarab that rolled the sun across the sky, his movement not labor but renewal, his path a reminder that even in stillness, life prepares to rise. At the height of day he became Ra, radiant and sovereign, and by evening, Atum, aged and wise, sinking beneath the horizon not in death but in retreat, his descent not a fall but a transformation. Yet Ra did not travel alone. His solar bark sailed through the Duat at night, a realm neither above nor below, but beside, stitched into the underlayer of reality where time folds and meaning flickers. There he faced not mortals, but chaos itself in the form of Apep. The serpent coiled endlessly, jaws wide, eyes burning with the hunger to unmake. Each night the battle resumed, and though Ra prevailed, he was never unscathed, never untouched by the nearness of dissolution. It was Set, the very god of disruption, who stood beside him then, not as rival, but as shield, proving that even chaos has its place when turned against deeper darkness. This paradox was not an error, it was a truth too complex to flatten, a balance maintained not by purity, but by harmony between opposites. Temples mirrored this divine symmetry, their axes aligned with solstices, their walls inscribed with liturgies that were also equations, their columns echoing the ribcage of the cosmos itself. Within their sanctuaries, the gods were bathed, clothed, fed. Rituals performed not for symbolism, but for sustenance. For in Egypt, belief was not thought but action, and to care for the gods was to anchor reality. Priests did not interpret. They enacted, becoming hands and breath and vessels through which eternity could enter the present. Ordinary people, too, carried amulets shaped like eyes, scarabs, feathers, not as ornaments but as contracts, miniature agreements with the invisible that order would hold, that the flood would return, that the dead would rise when called by name. And even those names shifted with time. Amun became Amun-Ra. Isis absorbed powers from faraway goddesses. Bastet and Sekhmet danced between tenderness and fury, as if divinity could never be contained in a single mood. Gods were not confined. They unfolded, responded, became what was needed, and sometimes what was feared. They did not demand belief, only remembrance, and so long as their stories were whispered beneath stars or carved into stone, they remained near. But if one god can wear 100 faces, then which one watches you when you dream? There are journeys that begin not with footsteps, but with flame, not across land, but through time, where the traveler is not a body, but a soul untethered, drifting through veils woven from silence and myth. Such is the path that Osiris took, not as a king returning to his throne, but as a presence folding inward, deeper than breath, deeper than the soil that cradles forgotten bones. In life, he ruled with a gentle hand, but in death he became something stranger, something larger, a judge, a mirror, a stillness through which every soul must pass. The Duat was not a place of punishment, nor a land of peace, but a terrain of meaning, its rivers thick with memory, its gates opening not with force but with knowledge, each step forward earned by remembering one's own name. The dead did not wander aimlessly. They traveled by rite, by spell, by preparation. And Osiris stood at the end of that path, not to punish, but to measure, to see whether the heart still sang in harmony with the laws of creation. Before him stretched the Hall of Two Truths, a place where silence was not empty, but listening, and in the center stood the scale, ancient and patient, one pan holding the heart of the deceased, the other the feather of Mayat, light as morning, weightless as integrity. Anubis, jackal of shadows, guardian of thresholds, adjusted the balance with hands that had wrapped countless corpses, while Thoth, ibis-headed scribe of precision, recorded the outcome without judgment, only accuracy. And beside the scale crouched Ammit, the devourer, her body stitched from the hungers of crocodile, lion, and hippopotamus, her eyes unblinking, her jaws waiting not in malice but in function. For a heart that tipped the scale too far would become hers, not out of cruelty, but necessity, for the unbalanced could not move forward, could not join the luminous. But for those whose hearts aligned with the feather, whose names had not been forgotten, whose truths had not unraveled, they became Ak, transfigured spirits, radiant and effective, welcomed into the field of reeds where crops grew tall without toil, where the air shimmered with eternity, where the sun touched every leaf as if it remembered each one by name. Some joined the solar bark, rowing with Ra through the underworld and sky in perpetual renewal. Others wandered back to the world of the living by day, unseen but near. And it was not only kings who passed this test. Peasants, scribes, mothers, children, all could stand before Osiris if they had lived in alignment with the pattern, if they had spoken truth, given water to the thirsty, bread to the hungry, remembrance to the forgotten. Tombs became gates, filled with texts and spells, coffins painted with maps and guardians, names etched to endure. For to be nameless was to drift, untethered, unable to be found by the light. And when the mummy was placed into its eternal chamber, when the priests intoned the final words, when the mouth was opened and breath restored symbolically, the journey began. Not into sleep, but into unfolding. Death in this world was never an end, but a question. And what if the answer waited not in the judgment, but in the silence just before the scale tips? It was said that no one remembered the first time the sun rose, because it had always risen again and again, long before there were names to greet it, or eyes to follow its light. Yet the ancient ones knew that what rose must also fall, and what shines must pass through shadow, and so they told not of a sun, but of a god, not of daybreak, but of a journey, long and perilous, repeated endlessly across the hours, the seasons, the very breath of existence. Ra, the sun god, was not simply the orb that climbed the sky, but the pulse of life itself, his path carved across heavens and underworlds alike. In the morning he was Khepri, scarab of renewal, pushing the disk of light from the underworld's edge, his limbs tireless, his shell reflecting the first gold of dawn. At noon he was Ra, ruler of the visible world, his eye burning with clarity, his gaze firm enough to hold the chaos at bay. But by evening he was Autumn, aged and introspective, the sun withdrawing not out of weakness, but necessity, retreating to prepare for the deeper battle that came when the stars awoke. For the night was not rest, it was war, and Ra did not vanish. He descended, boarding the Mesektet, the solar bark of the night, and entered the Duat, the hidden realm beneath the earth, a place of coils and spirits and shifting truths. 12 hours he traveled, one for each stage of darkness. His path lit not by sunlight, but by memory, by purpose, by the rhythm of what must be preserved. In each hour he faced guardians and gates, each one opening only to the correct name, the proper spell, the right offering spoken from lips long buried. But at the heart of this voyage lay a terror greater than forgetfulness. The serpent Apep, whose coils spanned horizon to horizon, whose body was hunger, whose breath was unmaking. Each night Apep rose from the waters of nothingness and attacked, seeking not to kill, but to undo, to return all form to formlessness, all rhythm to silence. And each night Ra, with his companions, Heka the magic, Hu the command, Sia the perception, and sometimes Set, god of storms and necessary violence, fought back the serpent with spears of fire and words sharper than obsidian. They never destroyed it. It only delayed it. For chaos cannot be killed, only held back, only kept at bay by endless vigilance and ritual. And as the bark moved forward through the darkest hour, Ra merged for a moment with Osiris, light and death intertwined. And from that union came the spark that would become dawn again. Thus, when the sun rose each morning, it was not by accident, not by nature, but by victory, hard won and dearly held. The people rose with the light not just to work, but to witness, to be reminded that order was a choice renewed each day, that behind the ordinary glow of morning was a war they could not see but deeply felt. Temples opened at dawn not to begin, but to affirm, reenacting in miniature the battles of the night, priests offering fire and bread to sustain what had been saved. And so each sunrise was a resurrection, each shadow a reminder of what had been risked. But if the serpent never dies, how long can the sun keep returning? Not all resurrections come with fanfare or flame. Some are born in the hush between breaths, in the weightless pause before a name is spoken, in the halls of ancient temples where sunbeams creep across painted columns and dust dances like ghosts of forgotten prayers. The Egyptians prepared not just for death, but for what lay beyond its veil, a preparation so intricate, so tender, that it reshaped their entire world. For them, the soul was no singular thing but a constellation of parts, each with its own desire, its own need, its own path. There was the Ka, the vital force, the echo of divine energy breathed into each life at birth, hungry for offerings even in death. There was the Ba, the wandering essence, bird-bodied and human-faced, which fluttered from the tomb each dawn to feel sunlight again, to visit loved ones, to drift through the world of memory before returning to the resting place at night. There was the Ren, the name, fragile yet enduring, which could outlive the body if spoken with reverence. And there was the shadow, the Sheyut, the silent twin that never left one's side, even when breath ceased. All of these sought reunification, the binding into the Akh, the transfigured spirit, radiant and eternal, whose form shimmered with the clarity of truth. But for that unification to take place, the body had to remain intact, recognizable, tethered to its spiritual fragments like a lighthouse for the drifting soul. Thus, mummification was no mere ritual. It was a technology of return, a sacred craft through which skin, bone, and sinew were coaxed into stillness without surrender, preserved not as relics, but as instruments awaiting activation. Embalmers became priests, surgeons, alchemists, performing rites that mirrored the dismemberment and reassembly of Osiris, wrapping the dead not just in linen but in myth, in memory, in purpose. Amulets were placed between folds of cloth, eyes to watch, beetles to renew, ankhs to breathe. The mouth was opened symbolically, ritually, so that the dead might speak, eat, call their name again in the hall of judgment. Coffins became not containers but boats, palaces, scrolls, painted with stars, with protective spells, with scenes of the voyage through the Duat. Texts like the Book of the Dead, the Amduat, and the Book of Gates were tucked into the wrappings or painted along the chamber walls, not as decorations, but as maps, passwords, and guides through a realm where knowledge lit the path like torches. For in the Duat, each hour brought change, and without preparation, the soul could lose its way, could falter before guardians, could forget its truth. And so the living poured their efforts into death, not out of fear, but out of hope. Hope that the journey would succeed, that the deceased would become luminous, effective, unbound by time. The tomb was a house of eternity, furnished with food, tools, games, perfumes, and even letters from the living, offerings of continuity, love folded into gesture. And though the desert eventually claimed most of these tombs, whispering sand into their cracks and silence into their corridors, still the belief endured, carried forward in ritual, in remembrance, in stone that refused to forget. But if the dead could rise by name, what happens when the name is no longer spoken? There were whispers older than kingship, older even than temples, that spoke of a time when gods did not linger in the heavens, nor wait behind altars, but walked beside rivers and sat beneath trees, their breath mingling with the wind and their steps pressing patterns into the soil. This era, veiled in the mist of myth, was known as Zep Tepi, the first time, not as a point on a timeline, but as a state of being, a golden hush before the noise of history, a moment when the world was still soft from creation and the divine moved through it like warmth through fabric. It was during this time that Ra, newly risen from the primordial waters, ruled over gods and men alike, not with command, but with presence. He brought order simply by existing, his light enough to keep chaos at bay, his gaze enough to sustain the turning of the sky. Yet, even in that golden hush, shadows stirred. Humanity, curious and ungrateful, plotted in secret, their hearts growing heavy with thoughts unsuited for a world so newly born. Ra, wearied by their discontent, withdrew, not in anger, but in resignation, rising into the sky atop the back of Nut, the star-strewn cow, leaving behind the realm he had shaped. But before his retreat, he did not abandon the world. He delegated, assigning Thoth to speak in his stead, and Osiris to rule the land of men. And so began the lineage of divine kingship, a thread that would wind through centuries, through dynasties, through dust and splendor alike. Osiris ruled not with iron, but with rhythm, guiding with the same patience that riverbanks lend to water, his hands planting seeds of law, harvest, and ritual. Isis ruled beside him, not behind, her wisdom as essential as his stability, her magic the thread that held the world from unraveling. Their reign, like the first time itself, was not about conquest, but about connection, about the weaving of heaven and earth into one cloth. And yet, as always, the world would not remain still. Set, born of the same sky and earth, carried in him not hatred, but disruption, a necessary imbalance, a fault line running through the divine order. His murder of Osiris was not just fratricide, but a wound in the very structure of reality, echoing outward in tremors that would reshape the myths to come. And in that rupture, a new era was born, not of peace but of restoration, not of gods walking in sunlight, but of gods withdrawing into the patterns of nature and the hearts of men. The divine kingship passed from God to semi-divine, from Horus to his followers, from memory to monument. Each pharaoh an echo of that first time, a reflection in flickering water. The king was not merely ruler, but the hinge upon which heaven turned, the axis around which the seasons aligned. His rituals not symbolic, but necessary, to keep the sun rising and the Nile flowing. He wore the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt not as trophies, but as harmonies, balancing opposites upon his brow. And though his blood ran warm and his hands bore the marks of mortal toil, he was more than man. He was presence, embodiment, the bridge between the visible and the veiled. And in coronation, in temple ritual, in the daily offerings to statues that blinked, not but heard all. The pharaoh renewed the contract first made in that golden hush, that moment before time hardened into chronology. But if the gods once walked among men, what traces of their footsteps still lie buried beneath the shifting sands, in a land where stone remembers longer than blood, and the wind carries voices long since stilled? Kings were not simply men crowned with gold. They were vessels through which the divine touched the world, not as thunder, but as presence, as rhythm, as ritual breathed into form. To be pharaoh was not to rule in the way later ages would understand it, but to maintain, to uphold the fragile balance between sky and soil, between flood and famine, between order and the ever-waiting mouth of chaos. From the moment of coronation, the king ceased to be a single life and became a pattern, a repetition of Horus made flesh, crowned not for power but for responsibility. His names, fivefold and sacred, wove him into the story of the land, each title a knot binding him to heaven, to the two lands, to the gods whose favor could not be demanded, only earned. He was called the living Horus, the son of Ra, the lord of appearances, not as flattery, but as truth spoken into shape. And his body bore the symbols of this burden: the false beard of Osiris, the crook and flail of shepherd and disciplinarian, the cobra upon his brow, poised to strike not for conquest, but for protection of the pattern. Temples rose not as monuments to his ego, but as instruments of his office. Each stone set to align with stars, each hall echoing the journey of Ra, each chamber housing a god who would receive offerings not from supplicants, but from the king himself or his appointed hands. The daily ritual was not ceremony, it was necessity, for if the god was not awakened, bathed, clothed, fed, and praised, then the thread might fray, the sun might stall, the flood might forget its time. In this way, the pharaoh was both priest and symbol, present in every act of worship, whether in body or in inscription, whether in the capital or the humblest shrine along the river. Yet even gods in flesh grew old, and when a king died, he did not disappear but transformed, stepping into the form of Osiris, ruler of the Duat, keeper of judgment, his body wrapped in linen not just to preserve, but to transfigure, to become again part of the cycle. His successor, crowned beneath stars and incense, became Horus anew, the sun rising as the father descended, a rotation not of lineage alone, but of cosmic function. Even foreign rulers who conquered Egypt could not claim legitimacy unless they adopted the regalia, the rites, the rhythm of kingship woven into the bones of the land. They stood before the gods not as conquerors, but as servants of the balance, for the land itself would not yield to one who did not honor the thread. Even in times of division, when claimants battled for the throne and temples echoed with competing prayers, the mythic framework held, adapting, absorbing, rebalancing like the Nile itself adjusting its course. And in rare moments of rupture, such as during the reign of Akhenaten, when old gods were silenced and new light proclaimed, the very fabric of kingship trembled, but did not tear. Even then, the return to tradition came not as rebellion, but as restoration, as if the gods had merely paused their breath and now exhaled again through familiar names, familiar rituals, familiar truths. For the pharaoh was not remembered by his victories or his monuments, but by whether the land remained fertile under his gaze, whether Mayat stood tall beside him or tilted in the wind. And though their names fade, and their tombs lie broken beneath sand and looters' hands, the echo remains, not in stone, but in the way the dawn still breaks upon the temples, and the way the river still flows, as if recalling a time when kings did not rule but remembered. But if the breath of a god once moved through mortal lungs, then what still stirs when the statues seem to watch, beneath the quiet hush of midnight, when the stars shimmer like forgotten promises, and the columns of ancient temples cast shadows longer than their stones? There lingers the scent of something older than devotion, a presence neither wholly divine nor entirely monstrous, but something in between, a flicker at the edge of firelight, a ripple in still water. For alongside the great gods who sat upon thrones of sky and judgment, there existed others, beings woven not from reverence but from uncertainty, from the spaces between stories, from fears half-named. These were not worshipped with hymns or gold, but acknowledged with silence, with charms tucked beneath pillows, with amulets worn close to the skin, with salt scattered at thresholds where the world grew thin. The Egyptians knew that the universe was not composed solely of light and form, but also of shadow and disruption, and in that space walked creatures of ambiguous intent, some protectors, some destroyers, many both. There was Apep, coiled and infinite, the serpent of unmaking, who rose from the black waters of nothingness each night to swallow Ra's bark and still the sun forever. Though he failed endlessly, he was never vanquished. For chaos is not a thing to be killed, but an inevitability to be delayed again and again, by ritual, by courage, by belief. And then there was Ammit, the devourer of hearts, who waited not in anger but in purpose, crouched beside the scale in the Hall of Two Truths, her jaws a final silence for those who tilted too far from harmony. Yet she too was necessary, a reminder that the cosmos did not punish but corrected. Even more ambivalent were the wandering spirits, the restless dead, those whose names were no longer spoken, whose tombs had been violated, whose hearts had never balanced. These might return not as ancestors, but as disturbances seen in dreams, felt in fevers, calmed only by offerings, by whispered names, by letters burned with honey and wine. And there were guardians of children and women in childbirth, gods with lions' manes, dwarf limbs, protruding tongues, fierce in form yet gentle in intent, like bays, who danced grotesquely to frighten away things that crept in dreams. Even the household had its share of watchers, figures carved onto bedposts or painted onto mirrors, their presence not ornamental but defensive, their eyes wide so that they might never sleep, even when the living did. The boundary between divine and monstrous was never fixed, for even the gods could shift. Hathor, gentle cow of joy and fertility, once became Sekhmet, lioness of blood, her rage so fierce that it nearly ended humanity until wine died like blood tricked her into sleep. Transformation was not anomaly, but nature, and in this the Egyptians saw truth. Not all that shines is safe, not all that terrifies is cruel, and sometimes salvation wears a mask that stares back without blinking. In the deeper texts, in the ritual books hidden from casual sight, there are names not often spoken aloud, entities who govern thresholds, who guard gates within gates, each requiring specific words, specific gestures, specific truths. Their forms are strange, twisted, not to frighten, but to reflect. They are the reminders that the unknown is always near, always watching, always waiting. And, as priests chanted and flames flickered against painted walls, they did not merely celebrate the light. They negotiated with the dark, not to banish it, but to hold it in place. And if some of those names have been lost, then who still listens when the wind calls them softly through the ruins, beyond the reach of the temple torches and the soft chanting of priests, where desert winds whisper to stones older than memory? There lies a silence too deep to name, a stillness wrapped around the tombs of the Valley of the Kings, carved not just into earth, but into the fold between the worlds. Here, beneath layers of rock and secrecy, the dead did not merely rest. They waited, preserved not for the sake of remembrance, but for a return, a continuation, a triumph over the forgetting that time demands. The Egyptians did not believe death was an end. It was a passage, a doorway through which only the prepared could walk, and so their tombs were not graves, but blueprints for the next world, each chamber a stanza in the poem of becoming. Walls painted with curling spells and serpent-limbed gods told stories no longer for the living, but for the Ka, for the Ba, for the Ak, guiding them through night into light. In these dark halls, the ceilings were painted as star maps, the floors as offerings, the sarcophagi as vessels of rebirth. And among these eternal houses, one tomb would capture more than dust and memory. It would ensnare wonder, fear, and curiosity for a century yet to come. The tomb of Tutankhamun, boy king of brief reign and unspoken lineage, lay untouched for more than 3,000 years, hidden not by grandeur, but by obscurity, as if the gods had wrapped him in anonymity as the final layer of protection. When Howard Carter broke the seal in 1922, he did not simply enter a tomb. He crossed a boundary, and the world changed. Gold shimmered in the light of torches, revealing a burial untouched by plunder, a snapshot of ritual in its purest form. Chariots, beds, weapons, amulets, alabaster vessels still fragrant with unguents sealed by hands long returned to sand. Yet, alongside awe came unease, for the uncovering of that tomb echoed with whispers older than stone. Tales of curses, of sickness, of deaths that followed like shadows. Lord Carnarvon, financier of the dig, died shortly after the tomb's opening, his passing sparking stories that flickered through newspaper columns like ancient spells revived in ink. Others connected to the excavation met sudden ends, each one woven into the tapestry of dread, as if the tomb itself exhaled a warning, subtle but insistent. Scholars debated, skeptics scoffed, but the feeling remained that something had been touched that did not wish to be disturbed. The Egyptians had always believed names held power, and that to name the dead was to summon them. So perhaps the boy king, once forgotten, now stood again in the minds of millions. His name whispered across continents, his image reborn in gold and mystery. But who was Tutankhamun truly? Pharaoh or puppet, restorer or relic, victim or symbol of a shift in cosmic favor? His story, though brief in life, now stretches longer than any reign, a thread binding modern wonder to ancient silence. And as visitors walk the halls of his tomb, now lit by electricity rather than oil, one must wonder not just what was found, but what was released when the seal was broken. There are places where stone no longer bears weight, but memory, where the desert has not erased, but preserved, pressing time into tablets and walls like petals dried between the pages of a forgotten book. Among these places, none hold the same silent authority as the great Sphinx of Giza. Guardian, enigma, monument, mystery. It lies not merely at the foot of the pyramids, but at the crossroads of myth and erosion. Its leonine body stretched like a slumbering god, and its human face, worn by centuries of wind and neglect, still watching with an expression that defies translation. Carved from a single ridge of limestone, older than most temples, older perhaps even than the pyramids it watches over, the Sphinx remains without inscription, its origin unstated, its purpose unstamped by certainty. Tradition attributes it to Khafra, builder of the second pyramid, yet the erosion patterns tell another story. Rain-worn gullies that suggest a date when Egypt was not desert, but savanna. Some say it is 10,000 years old, others that it is timeless, a relic of Zep Tepi, when gods shaped the world not with tools, but with dreams. Between its paws lies the dream stele, left by Thutmose IV, who, as a young prince, claimed he slumbered in its shadow and dreamed the Sphinx spoke to him, promising kingship in return for its restoration. Whether true or crafted after the fact, the story clings to the monument like breath on glass, a tale of voices in stone, of destinies bargained beneath the stars. The Sphinx has been buried by sand more than once, as if the earth itself seeks to swallow it again, to undo the exposure, to return the guardian to its slumber. But each time, the wind uncovers it anew, or hands compelled by fascination dig it free, and the riddle reasserts itself. There are no chambers within its body, no texts to guide the mind, only the form. Body of lion, face of man, gaze set not forward, but into the horizon as if watching for something that has not yet returned. Legends persist that beneath it lie tunnels, archives, or even the fabled Hall of Records, a library of a lost age, sealed not with bricks but with forgetting. Seekers come with instruments, with sensors, with questions. But the Sphinx offers only silence, and the wind that plays about its massive paws carries no answers. And yet something lingers, a feeling subtle but insistent that the monument is not merely inert, but waiting, not asleep, but patient. Its face, though damaged, still bears the marks of intention, eyes that once glinted with inlaid stone, lips that may have once smiled or worn. And while the rest of Giza speaks of death and preservation, the Sphinx speaks of presence, of something held in tension across epochs, like a chord not yet resolved. And if no inscription tells its name, then who whispered first the riddle it was meant to guard? When the Nile retreats and the floodplains crack under the summer heat, the bones of the land begin to speak, not with voice, but with presence, with silence carved deep into the skin of ruins that once echoed with chants and ceremony. And among these voices, few are as haunting as those found at Abydos, the ancient city where myth and memory entwine like twin vines around the pillars of time. Here, the temple of Seti I does not simply rise from the earth. It emerges as if drawn from another layer of reality, its limestone walls still sharp with reliefs too perfect for decay, too sacred for erosion. Unlike the grandeur of Karnak or the solemnity of Luxor, Abydos breathes an older rhythm, a sacred pulse tied not just to gods, but to the act of remembering itself. For it was here that Osiris, god of death and rebirth, was said to have been buried, or at least remembered, and the site became less a location and more a portal, a point of convergence between the living and the eternal. Pilgrims came not to marvel, but to renew, their footsteps tracing the outlines of a myth older than language, their offerings not requests, but acknowledgments. Within the temple lies something stranger still, the Osirion, a subterranean structure far below the level of the surrounding buildings, its stone blocks massive, its construction inexplicably precise, its water-slick floor reflecting pillars that seem too ancient even for Seti's time. It feels different, colder, deeper, not merely in depth, but in intent, as though it was not built for men to walk, but for gods to pass through. A place not for ceremony, but for alignment, for the binding of cycles not meant to be broken. Many believe it was meant to mirror the underworld itself, a model of the Duat, where the soul of the pharaoh journeyed among stars and serpents and judgment, seeking union with Ra at dawn. Others whisper that the structure predates the temple above, an inheritance from a forgotten epoch, absorbed into later belief like a fossil embedded in ritual. The energy here does not rise like incense, but pulls downward, inward, inviting not reverence but reflection, not celebration but surrender. And carved along the walls above, Seti I left the famous king list, a genealogy of rulers reaching back into time, line after line of names etched not merely to record, but to solidify, to weave legitimacy from the past into the present. Yet conspicuously absent are certain names: Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, Shmenkhkare, figures erased not by time but by intent, as if memory itself could be sculpted and trimmed to fit a new order. But the walls know more than they tell, and even the air seems to hold echoes of those names, no longer spoken aloud yet refusing to disappear entirely. Abydos does not merely house gods, it houses questions, and among its stones one senses not conclusion but suspension, as though the final rite has yet to be performed. And if Osiris still lies buried here, then what dream stirs beneath the stone that drinks the flood each year? As the night deepens and the wind carries a cooler hush across the temples and empty courtyards, there emerges a pattern in the way time folds across the Nile. Not a straight line, but a spiral, a circling back, a remembering of itself in forms both familiar and altered. Nowhere is this more evident than in the ancient city of Thebes, once the beating heart of the Middle and New Kingdoms, where gods walked in procession and kings aligned themselves with the divine pulse of the universe. It is here that the Temple of Karnak rises not as a single structure, but as a compound of intentions, a symphony in stone spanning generations, each pharaoh adding his own note to a melody that never ended, only shifted. Its great hypostyle hall, forested with columns thicker than trees, seems less constructed and more grown. Its ceilings painted with stars that once mirrored the sky and now trap silence like smoke caught in alabaster. Walking among these pillars, one feels small not in fear, but in reverence, as though the very air remembers ritual, remembers incense, remembers breath. Karnak was not merely a temple, it was a mechanism, aligned with solstices, with stars, with the flooding of the river and the movement of celestial boats. Each statue faced not a direction, but a principle. Each obelisk pointed not upward, but toward Ra, whose light was both sustenance and surveillance. But within all this grandeur, the most sacred movement was not always seen by the masses. Once a year, during the Opet festival, the god Amun would leave his inner sanctum, carried in a golden bark from Karnak to Luxor Temple along the Avenue of Sphinxes, his journey reenacting creation itself, reaffirming kingship, renewing the thread. This was not pageantry, but recalibration, a moment when the cosmos was reminded of its order, and the people of Egypt were reminded of their place within it. The bark, covered in cloth and mystery, swayed with power unseen, accompanied by priests and music and the murmurs of thousands, a procession of both spectacle and stillness. And, as the god reached Luxor, the twin of Karnak in spirit if not in scale, the alignment of heaven and earth was sealed again for another year. These rituals were not decoration. They were maintenance, the oil that kept the machinery of the world from rusting into chaos. And yet, over time, the avenue fell silent. The barks ceased to float, and the gods no longer walked among men in form. What remains now are stones and stories, columns that hold up a sky no longer watched by priests, courtyards that echo only with wind. And yet, when the equinox returns and the sun slides perfectly between the ruins, casting light exactly where it once did thousands of years ago, the question is not how they knew, but why they needed the gods to pass through light in order to remain real. And if the god's bark was meant to carry balance, then what did it leave behind the last time it failed to return? Somewhere beyond the reach of calculation, where sand drowns memory and the wind seems to echo with syllables no tongue has spoken for millennia, lies the notion that not all temples were made for worship. Some were built to record, to encode, to resist the unraveling of time by hiding truths not in language, but in alignment, in stone that hums with purpose even when silent. The Temple of Hathor at Dendera offers such a whisper, not loud, not pleading, but firm, like a hand pressed against one's shoulder in a dream. From the outside, it is majestic, yet familiar, its columns topped with the smiling visage of the sky goddess who wore music like a veil. Inside, the reliefs unfold in the usual sacred logic, offerings, blessings, gods in procession. But deeper within, carved onto the walls of a crypt few were meant to enter, lies something stranger. Figures holding what appear to be elongated bulbs, connected by cables to boxes, with serpents coiled inside the light. Modern minds call them Dendera lights, not because that was their name, but because that is the only name they can find for the unfamiliar. Some see ancient electricity, others symbolic metaphors of rebirth and illumination. But what is undeniable is this: the image does not repeat elsewhere, and it does not conform. And nearby, at Abydos, even more puzzling images are said to emerge. A shape like a helicopter, another like a submarine, all too crisp to be ignored, too controversial to be embraced. Scholars call them palimpsests, mistakes of overlapping hieroglyphs carved centuries apart, an accident of erosion and layering. But the question remains: why do the errors resemble the future and not something else? Egypt was not only a land of gods, but of patterns, and the deeper one looks, the more those patterns seem intentional, as though the builders were not just constructing temples, but encoding timelines, drawing maps for an age yet to come. The ceiling of Dendera bears a zodiac, circular and complete, with figures familiar not to Egypt alone, but to Babylon, to Greece, to the very stars we still watch. The temple speaks in layers, each deeper than the last, as though Hathor herself, goddess of love and ecstasy, and the deep celestial void, offered not comfort but awareness, of cycles, of returns, of a knowledge that hums beneath the skin when night grows still. And if these carvings are symbols, then what do they symbolize that the priests hid them so far from casual eyes? And if they are not symbols, then what visitor once stood in that chamber and left behind the memory of light? Far to the south, where the Nile narrows and the horizon burns with a redder fire, there lies a land once called Nubia, a realm not of Egypt, but bound to it by conquest, trade, and blood, where temples rise in sandstone instead of limestone, and the gods wear crowns shaped by other winds. And among the temples carved from cliffs and pressed into silence by time, none commands awe quite like Abu Simbel, where 4 seated colossi of Ramses II gaze out across the water with expressions unmoved by storm or sun. They do not invite. They declare their presence not a welcome, but a reminder, carved to face south, as if to warn or bless all who came up the Nile toward the heart of Egypt. Within, the temple stretches into darkness, chamber after chamber, each lined with images of the pharaoh not as man, but as divine extension, striding beside Horus and Ra, wielding power not borrowed but assumed. Yet, for all its grandeur, the temple holds a quieter marvel, an alignment so precise that twice each year, as the sun rises on specific days, its light reaches into the innermost sanctuary, illuminating the statues of the gods, but leaving Ptah, god of the underworld, in shadow, as if even light obeyed the theology of the living and the dead. This dance of architecture and astronomy was not accidental. It was the language of permanence, of mastery over both space and time. And when the Aswan Dam threatened to drown Abu Simbel beneath rising waters, the world watched as modern engineers moved the temple, block by block, reassembling the past with trembling precision, so that the light would still strike, the shadows still fall, the ritual continue. It was not merely preservation, it was participation in an ancient contract, one that said the gods may sleep, but must never be forgotten. And yet, what does it mean that this monument to eternity had to be rescued from water by human hands? Were the ancients wrong to trust stone to hold forever? Or were they right to build in ways that demand we remember not only the structure, but the intention? And if the sun still finds its mark after millennia and migration, then what else does it illuminate, quietly, that we have yet to notice? In the sands beyond the edge of cultivated memory, where the desert no longer yields even to myth, there exist places spoken of only in fragments, ruins unnamed, stones half buried, as though time itself grew weary and left the task of forgetting unfinished. Among these is the story of a hall that no temple claims and no king is said to have built, a chamber whispered of in the legends of seekers and esoteric scribes, the so-called Hall of Records. It is said to lie beneath the Sphinx or hidden beneath a plateau long cleared of monuments, sealed before the First Dynasty, encoded not in hieroglyph, but in geometry, in resonance, in the positions of stars that no longer occupy their ancient thrones. Those who search for it speak not of blueprints but of alignments, of Orion's belt and the subterranean tunnels of Giza, of flood lines and seismic echoes, of chambers glimpsed in sonar and dismissed in reports. Some say it holds tablets, others say sound, vibrations etched into crystal or stone, not to be read but heard, not decoded but remembered. Legends claim it contains the lost wisdom of Atlantis, the teachings of Thoth, the blueprints of civilizations erased before Egypt took its first breath. Yet, for all the theories and maps and symbols traced across dusty screens, no one has stood in that hall. No one has placed their hand on its walls or spoken aloud within its silence. The question, then, is not merely where it is, but why it remains hidden, and what would be undone if it were found. For the ancients did not build without reason, and what they buried, they did so not out of fear, but out of rhythm, as though some knowledge must sleep until the world can bear to awaken it. And while the Sphinx gazes forward, and the pyramids cast their long shadows east, one wonders whether they point not to the heavens alone, but to something buried between them, beneath them or behind them, waiting for a pattern to return. And if the Hall of Records was sealed with a purpose, then what truth would it speak if someone dared to open the stone that dreams? There is a silence that does not fade with distance, a quiet that deepens the longer one listens, as though the land itself holds its breath. Egypt is full of such silences, not empty, but full of echoes pressed flat with age, echoes of sandals on limestone, of prayers carried upward in smoke, of stars reflected in temple pools long since dried to dust. But among these, there lingers one final presence, not bound to any monument or god, but to the idea that the past is not gone, only folded, like linen around a mummy's form, layered in meaning and intention. For the ancient Egyptians believed that names held power, that memory was not passive but sacred, that to forget was to undo, and to remember was to awaken. They etched their stories not in ink, but in stone, not for us, but for the afterlife. And yet here we stand, thousands of years later, tracing their shapes with uncertain fingers, hearing the faint music of their myths in the hush between questions. From the cosmic wars of Horus and Set to the nightly voyage of Ra through the underworld, their myths were not entertainment. They were survival, instructions, explanations for the chaos they refused to accept as final. In their world, nothing ended. It transformed, it circled, it emerged again in a new form, the same soul beneath a different mask. And so perhaps this is why the pyramids still stand, why the Sphinx still watches, why the tombs still whisper, because the story has not ended, only paused. And As each generation stares into the hollow eyes of a statue or reads a glyph half lost to erosion, the tale begins again, reshaped by the minds that dare to listen. For the gods may sleep, but they do not vanish. They drift just beyond the veil of what we call real, waiting for someone not to prove them, but to remember them. And if the stars once aligned to mark the birth of kings, then what alignment waits now, quiet and unnoticed, ready to begin the next chapter not in stone, but in dream. Tonight, let's wander, where no maps can guide us. Welcome to Forgotten History.